Hey everyone, Matt Brunig here. For this video, I wanted to address this paper and the argument that this paper makes, which a lot of people will make from time to time, which is about why is it that European countries, and here I'll kind of in parentheses say Nordic countries, because that's my focus, are more equal than the United States. You see, we have this kind of battle that occurs between two different groups of people. On the one hand, you have people who say, well, the main reason they're so much more equal is because they have these big welfare states, right? So they levy taxes on people, and then they use those taxes to help create a more equal society through public spending and social benefits. And then you have another group of people who really want to emphasize the idea, no, it's not the government and the redistribution through taxing and transferring that matters. It's predistribution. It's the fact that they have squeezed the differences between highly paid workers and low paid workers, and the fact that workers get more of the profits of the firm than they do in other countries, and things like that. And this paper came out a few years ago, and I would say every few months it goes wild online. And I would say especially the right wing likes to pick it up. And the reason it goes wild online is because the conclusion seems a little bit hard to believe and a little bit against a lot of the prevailing narratives about why some countries are more equal than others. So the title is, Why is Europe More Equal Than the United States? Here are the authors. And you can see the sort of shock conclusion is right here. Unfortunately, it spans 2 pages. And it reads as follows. Contrary to a widespread view, we demonstrate that Europe's lower inequality levels cannot be explained by more equalizing tax and transfer systems. After accounting for indirect taxes and in-kind transfers, the U.S. redistributes a greater share of national income to low-income groups than any European country. Predistribution, not redistribution, explains why Europe is less equal than the United States. Right, so they're taking the other stance. You guys think it's taxes and transfers. You guys think it's the welfare state. No, it's actually predistribution. It's actually the fact that the wage scale is more compressed, that the companies have less profit because more of that profit flows to workers and blah, 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 blah. Right, that's what they want you to say. And if you scroll through this thing, some of the graphs people like to present, I suppose they're probably at the bottom here. Like, this is a big one. No, not that one. Sorry, there's one that looks like it, but is not that one. Here it is, right? Net redistribution in Europe and the United States. You see, and then where's the U.S.? The U.S. is right here. Number 1, we have the most redistribution on this measure. And then you look at other countries where you think, they're pretty redistributive. There's Finland. Finland's, way below. Denmark, Sweden. I don't see Norway on here. Here's Norway. I guess Norway's up there. Anyways, that's what people like to do. Now, this paper is, to me, really silly. And mostly, obviously, people don't read these papers. They read the abstracts, and they like to screenshot the graphs. But here's why. If you scan the paper at all, you realize very quickly it's saying something that people who are reading it don't understand that it's saying. So in order to determine how much redistribution is occurring, you have to have a notion of pre-tax income, the income before redistribution, and then you have to have a measure of the income after redistribution. Here they'll call it pre-tax income for before redistribution, and then post-tax income for after redistribution. So the devil is always in the details of these two income concepts. What are you counting as income before redistribution, and what are you counting as income after redistribution? How do you create those specific measures? And here, right off the bat, we get this troubling sentence. Pre-tax income corresponds to the income after the operation of social insurance systems, but before other types of redistribution, right? So I guess we start up here. Is there another one? Yeah, there's factor income. So factor income is going to be wages and profits, basically, interest, things like that you get out of the market. Then pre-tax income, we add on to that the operation of social insurance systems, but other types of redistribution, but not counting other types of redistribution, right? So we get factor income plus pension benefits. So that's 17% of all national income, a large maybe minority of the welfare state. They're counting that in pre-tax income. Unemployment and disability benefits, they're counting that in pre-tax income. Okay? So that is the bulk of the welfare state, especially the cash welfare state, is these social insurance systems. And they're counting that as income that you received prior to redistribution. So in the U.S., that would be Social Security, that would be Social Security disability insurance, that would be SSI, that would be unemployment insurance, all that stuff. You might think, oh, that's the welfare state, that's redistribution. Here, before redistribution. That's counted as being before redistribution. Okay? And then we've got another kicker here. Okay, great. So the big social insurance schemes, they're counting as pre-tax income for some reason. What about post-tax income? What are they doing with the rest of the redistributive welfare state types incomes? And here we've got an interesting bit here. So they include, here we go. The other government benefits are social assistance transfers, 5% of national income. So here they're going to be talking about stuff like food stamps, WIC, TANF, right? That's 5% of national income. So remember, pensions alone are 17% of national income. Social Security, in other words, as we would call it here, is 17% of national income. They count that as pre-tax income, and then they count this part of the welfare state as that's the real welfare state. That's the post-tax income, right? It's less than a third of just the Social Security program, you know? So they add that in, and then here's the other kicker, because this is the other big amount, right? They distribute other public spending proportional to post-tax disposable income, and that other public spending is 17% of national income. So here we're talking about spending on schools, pre-K, police, firemen, courts, whatever, military. They take all of that and they distribute it proportionately to post-tax disposable income, which is to say they just don't count that at all as being redistributive, right? So it's not like they go into each household and they say, how much are you getting from free kindergarten or childcare, as they have in many of these systems? How much money are you getting from free public education? And then they just impute that to your income and count that as redistribution. No, they are just taking that, and if you made $100,000 last year, you are treated as if you received 10 times as much money from these other public benefits as someone who made $10,000 of income. Does that make sense? So they're basically just not counting that as reducing inequality at all. It's basically neutralized. It might as well just be off the balance sheet. It's just not being counted. The only exception here is public health expenditure. So they do take the public health insurance and they divide it equally throughout the population and say, okay, so that one ends up being redistributed. Long story short, what the paper actually shows is that if you ignore the vast majority of the welfare state and you only count shit like food stamps, the U.S. number one. Ridiculous, in my opinion. But it's one thing to kind of clown on this paper. That's fun. I do that in this paper here, in this piece here called The Trouble with Analyzing Redistribution. But what I wanted to do actually is use this as a nice little peg to give you a better sense of how to think about redistribution and how to think about how to measure redistribution. And once you get your head on right about this, you'll be able to spot people who are floating weird claims. You'll be able to spot what's going on there. And also, I think you'll just have a clearer head about, in a way, the futility of this whole kind of approach to trying to figure out who redistributes the most and what's more important, redistribution or predistribution. You should be able to kind of clear that out of your head, I think, once you understand how this all works, at least if you understand it the way I understand it, which I think is very clear and is the correct way to understand it. So for that, I thought let's just go through some of the graphs that I included in this piece, which I think are very illuminating. So let's start here. I took the 2019 current population survey, so this is before COVID, right? And I just took every single person in that survey and I assigned them to one of these groups. right? So you're a full-time worker if you worked every week of the year for 35 hours or more, like on average. Vacations and stuff like that, we don't count that against you, right? So basically, if you work 35 hour, if you have a 35 hour or more a week per job and you were employed the whole year in it, you're a full-time worker. Other workers are people who worked any other amount during the year. Then we have unemployed people. These are people who are unemployed the entire year, right? Because if they worked at all, they would have been another worker. And then we have disabled people. These are people who didn't work at all, and the reason they didn't work, at least the one they gave the survey taker, is that they were disabled. Carers didn't work at all because they were caring. Other, it's anyone who's not in the other group. See, kind of a small little sliver here. Then we got elderly or retired. So elderly is going to be, I didn't work, and I'm over the age of 65. So all this gray here. And then we have retired. These are people who didn't work all year, and they said that that's because they were retired. Right, so we got kind of this retired bit, and then we got this elderly bit. And then we got children and students. So children are going to be people who didn't work at all and were below the age of 18. So right here, all this green. And then we got students, and you see there's a little tail of students here as people are in college and grad school and stuff like that. And we've got ages at the bottom, right? So it's almost like you can think about this as being 81 different bar graphs from age 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you just smush the bar graphs together, if that makes sense. And you get a nice little population pie here, right? And so you can kind of see, right in the middle in these key prime ages, a lot of the people, most of the people are working. And then there's a sliver of people who aren't because they were jobless all year, but not that many. Quite a bit more people who are disabled who aren't working. You got maybe stay-at-home moms, stay-at-home dads. And then you got kids and elderly, like pretty intuitive sense of this is what the population looks like. Now here becomes the issue. If you have a population that looks like this, and the way that you distribute income in your society is to people who work or to people who own. Well, the problem you're going to run into very clearly is, one, this group right here, the children and the students, they're not working, and they probably don't own. Children don't own anything, but they are not going to own very much. They're too young to have accumulated much in the way of assets, I suppose. You got trust funds and that kind of thing. But by and large, these people, they got no way to get money from the market directly, right? Now, they might live with a parent who gets money from the market, but personally, they don't get any money from the market. And the same is going to be true for these disabled people here, because remember, they're defined as people who aren't working. Right? So they're not getting anything. They might here at the end be getting some if they saved and now they have a big, brokerage account. There's like some people like that here. But for the most part, they're not getting anything. Even for the elderly, there are, a decent chunk of the elderly have a good amount of money set aside. And so they're earning money on their 401ks and stuff like that. But you'd be surprised. There's a large percentage of the elderly. I would say even about 50% or more of the elderly who they have very, very little assets, and the only way they're going to be living off anything is Social Security, right? So this is the basic issue, right? These people get a lot of money from working. These people here get some money from assets, but you'd be surprised a lot of people in this group still aren't getting much money getting much money from assets. Asset ownership is very concentrated even among the old. And then these folks right here, they don't get anything. So the challenge becomes, how do we get money to all these people? So let's go to this graph that I was just on. In this graph, what I do, and hold with me here, it looks a little intimidating, but it's not. What I do is I take the exact same categories as before, exact same categories here, and then I say, how much personal market income is each of these people receiving? Personal market income. And by personal, how much are you as a person receiving? Not how much is your spouse receiving, not how much is your parent receiving, not how much is your roommate receiving. Some of these measures use household income, so you get income from your roommates and stuff. No, how much do you get sort of directly to you from the market into your bank account, whether that's a dividend, a paycheck, or whatever, right? And on the bottom here, instead of having ages like we have here, I use personal market income percentile. Again, this could be a little intimidating, but the best way to think about it here is from here to here. You see this 0 to 10? This is the bottom 10%. This is the 10% of people who have the lowest personal market income, right? And then from 90 to 10, we got the top 10%. So this is the 10% of people who have the highest personal market income percentile. And you can just kind of do that with each one of them. And again, like with the age graph, another way to view this is just to view it as if it's 101 bar graphs, all just crammed together, with each bar graph being a percentile, right? The 0 percentile, the 1 percentile, the 2 percentile, the 3 percentile, the 4 percentile, and it's all just squished together. Okay, so with that explained, what have we got here? If you look at it, here's the bottom of the personal market income distribution. This is the bottom. This is the bottom 30%. If we start from the 30 and we go over, the bottom 30%. Who is in the bottom 30%? Well, it's just children and students. I mean, it's just kids. Kids are making up damn near 70% of the bottom 30%. And of course, that's going to make sense. Kids don't work. They can't work. It's illegal for them to work. And they don't have assets, right? Because if we go the flip side of kids, we have the elderly and the retired, right? So, these are kind of sandwiching the age distribution. We got kids and students on one hand, and we got elderly and retired on the other. Elderly and retired on the other, you see quite a lot of them down here too, but you'll notice they're moved up a little bit up here, and that's because some of these folks, they do have pensions and they do have assets, and so they do receive income from that. Kids don't. Right? And then under the kids and the elderly, of course, we've got the carers and we've got the disabled, and here are all the people who are unemployed all year. So when you look at it like this and you start thinking to yourself, what kind of society is going to be the best for the bottom 30% of the population, if that's how you want to think about it, as like the poor or whatever? Well, it's going to be the people who have benefits for these groups of people. It's going to be people who have a welfare state that provides a lot of money to kids in the form of a child allowance, in the form of child care benefits, in the form of educational benefits, K through 12, free pre-K, paid leave, depending on how you want to think about that particular benefit. It's going to be people that have robust family benefits, defined as benefits for children. It's going to be people who have good public pensions for the elderly, and people who have good disability benefits for the disabled, and then even people who have caregiver benefits, such as home child care allowances or other kinds of benefits for home caregivers. It has to be that, because as you see, the workers are all up here, right? So for the most part, when you're talking about predistribution, what you're talking about is shrinking the differences between low-paid workers, which we can kind of think of as being right here, and high-paid workers. And cool, you should shrink these differences, right? You want the gap between the 50th percentile and the 100th percentile. You want to shrink that, and you can do that, and these countries have shrunk that gap quite substantially. But you're talking about shrinking the gap between the top half of the personal market income distribution. That's where the workers are. The non-workers, the kids, the elderly, and the disabled, they're over here. So messing around with the distribution inside the blue here is important, I think, and I spent a lot of time explaining how best to do that. But at the end of the day, it's these folks over here. That's where the welfare state's going to kick in, and that's how that's what you're going to need to reach them. It would seem. But the devil is in the details, and it really kind of is going to depend on how you want to measure things. So let's go to the next graph here. This graph, same thing as the prior one, but I make one modification. Instead of personal market income, we go to family market income. And the way family market income works is you take each person's personal market income, and then you see who they live with in their household, right? And everyone they're related to in their household, and that makes up their family. So all the money, all the personal income of everyone in a family goes in a bucket, a family bucket. And then we take that money and we just divide it out evenly between all the people in the family. So you think about a mom and dad and two kids. You take the mom's personal market income, you take the dad's personal market income, you put it in a pot and you divide it by 4. You don't technically divide it by 4 because the kids get lower weighting than adults, and there are economies of scale for larger families and all that kind of stuff. But that's the basic gist. You put the money in a pot and you spread it out. And you can imagine all sorts of arrangements. What if they also have an uncle that lives with them and he makes money? Well, that money goes in the pot too. And maybe one of the kids, he's 17 and he's working a part-time job. That money goes in the pot too, right? So what you do is you pool all the family's market income together and then you assign it to all the individuals in the family. And when you do that, you see you get a very different graph. To remember, this graph looks like this. If you're just adding how much each person gets personally, it looks like this. When you put people into families and then you assign them income based on their family's income, it looks like this. Now, the biggest thing you're going to see here is the kids have been spread out, right? And this one, they're all on the bottom. They're making up 70% of the bottom third of the population. Here, they're spread out. There's still more on the bottom. You can see this kind of marches up over time, but they're more spread out. So instead, what you wind up with is you just see a lot of old people at the bottom. And this makes sense because, again, although there are some elderly people who are quite wealthy and do have quite large incomes from their assets, there are a lot more who are just kind of scrimping and living off of Social Security, right? So we've got, when we do this, kids move out of the bottom, and the bottom just gets completely occupied by the elderly and the disabled, right? And notice that the workers are starting to move down the ladder. Here, the workers, they're only really coming in, especially full-time workers, are really coming in around 40, the top 60%, right? Here, you got workers coming in at 10 percentile, the 20th percentile, right? It's right. And so it looks a lot different. Now, nonetheless, even when you look at this, you're going to say, well, clearly what's most important for poverty and inequality is going to be your old age benefits and your disability benefits, right? I mean, look at the bottom 10% is old people and disabled folks, even under this measure. Kids, less so. Kids, less so. You don't have to worry about them as much because they're kind of, spread out now. But it's still old people and disabled people. So the welfare state still seems like it's going to be key. It's just going to be these two parts of the welfare state instead of the other parts of the welfare state. That seemed to be suggested by the first graph, right? But what if I did one more thing? What if I did one more thing to modify this? And this is what they do in this paper. What if I take the exact same graph as before with the family income concept, and I go ahead and just count Social Security and unemployment benefits as if it is market income, or as they call it, pre-tax income? What if I just pack that into your income? Now we see the elderly and the disabled people. There used to be this big fat wedge of elderly people here. They're all spread out. Disabled people, not as spread out, but quite a bit more spread out. Why? Because they're getting Social Security checks. And if you count Social Security checks as if it is pre-tax income, you're going to push them up the ladder, right? So instead of having a bunch of elderly people who have basically no personal income or family income, instead of having them sit at the bottom, they're spread out, right? And I want to emphasize a couple things with this, right? Because there's two things that go on here when you make these kinds of modifications. The first thing is a lot of the stuff that is the welfare state, instead of counting it as the welfare state, instead of counting it as redistribution, you end up packing it into pre-tax income, which means that stuff just doesn't get counted at all. That stuff, the inequality reduction that comes from that stuff is just missing, right? That's the obvious problem with doing this. But there is a sneakier, less obvious problem with doing this, which is that what happens when you give them their Social Security checks and put that into your market income concept or your pre-tax income concept, what happens when you give them the money that way is not only do you take all that money out of the welfare state and stop counting it, but you also push them up the ladder and you push workers down the ladder, right? And if you push workers down the ladder, the more workers you can put into the bottom of your income distribution, your pre-tax income distribution, the more workers you can put at the bottom of that distribution, the more important pre-distribution or wage compression is for low inequality, right? Because here, like I was describing here, in the first graph, if you're talking about, look, I want to reduce the inequality between workers. I want to make it so that the higher paid workers and the lower paid workers, that their incomes are more similar. Okay, cool. You're talking about those squeezing the differences between, like the 50th percentile and the 100th percentile. That's what you're talking about doing. Not unimportant, but that's not where the action is. Here, in the second graph, you're talking about the same kind of thing, but it's reaching lower down, but it's still kind of higher up, right? You're still mostly talking about folks who are kind of in the middle to upper end of the income distribution. By the time we get here, there's so many more workers in the bottom of the income distribution because of the way that they're counting things, that wage compression just matters a lot more than it used to. Right? Because the more low paid workers you put in the bottom of your income distribution, the more their pay matters to inequality. And I have another graph here because another thing people sometimes do, which this paper did not do, is the elderly are so vexing. Let's go back to this one. The elderly are so difficult to deal with because if you have old people, basically old age pension is the thing that matters the most. So that's so difficult to deal with. One thing to do is just to give them their pensions and count that as pre-tax income. Now you've dealt with them. You've pushed them up the ladder. The other thing you can do is you can just ignore them. And some papers will just ignore elderly households and they'll say, well, that's just not what we're focused on and blah, 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 whatever. This is what it looks like when you ignore elderly households. Now you still have some gray here because we have some non-elderly retired people. But when you do this, wow, man, look, the workers are so far down in the distribution that, again, wage compression matters a lot more. So, I don't know what to I do know what to conclude from this. The conclusion from this is don't let these efforts at trying to who redistributes the most and does it matter the most. People who are doing this math kind of pull the wool over your eyes from something that is fundamentally very simple, right? The fundamentally very simple thing is, in a capitalist economy, factor income flows to workers and it flows to owners. People who aren't workers or owners, if you want to have an equal society, you got to find some way to get them money. And that's usually called the welfare state. Okay? And you can goof around with these numbers and be like, what if I counted most of the welfare state as pre-tax income? What if I assigned each person's parents' income as if it's theirs or their spouse's income as if it's theirs? You can do all this shit and you can reach other kinds of conclusions in your spreadsheets if you want. But the basic mechanics are still very clear. They're still very clear, right? Which is that you got all these kids and old people and disabled folks who've got no way to get personal money, and you got to find some way to get them money. And that's what the welfare state is. And so I wanted to finish this video with this piece, which I wrote earlier this year. And basically this piece was just an excuse to get John White to recreate this old welfare state diagram, which I love so much. This was a diagram that was initially published in Switzerland in the 1940s, and obviously he's completely sort of revamped it here, made it beautiful for the modern eye. But what I like about this is it illustrates the point I was making, and it's old-timey. It's from the 1940s and from Switzerland. So, hey, if they were thinking the same thing I'm thinking, then I must be on to something. That's at least how it makes me feel, right? So let's look at this graphic. So it's a two-paneled little thing here. It says why we need the welfare state. The first panel we have, this is what it's like without the welfare state. And we got two workers, and the two workers, they work at this factory. The factory has this rich monopoly man owner, right? We got the two workers. They're identical workers. They get the exact same pay, but they go home at night, and one worker, he lives alone. He's a sole individual. And so he's got his whole paycheck just for himself. This worker, he lives with a spouse, who in this case is disabled. Got the two kids, and we got the old dad, right? So he's got to spread his money across 5 people, right? And so what we get here is we get equal work, because they're two workers, they're working the exact same amount, they're getting the exact same wage. So they're fully compressed in terms of pre-distribution. In terms of pre-distribution between these two individuals, they have the exact same pay. This would be like what if every worker made the exact same paycheck, okay? Equal work, equal pay, unequal livelihoods. You see? This one's got essentially 5 times as much income as this guy has when you adjust it for the number of people this guy has to stretch his income across, okay? So how do we fix that problem? And as the Swiss determines, and as I'm trying to make the case for many years now, that's what the welfare state is for. So in this kind of diagram, a simplified diagram, what happens? We still have equal work and equal pay, but instead of just giving the money to each worker and saying, hey, good luck, and one of them lives by himself and the other one lives with 4 other people, we take from each of their paycheck or each of their earnings and we put it in a common pot called the welfare state. And then out of the welfare state, we give a check to each one of these non-workers. Disability benefit for the spouse, child benefit for the kids, plus pre-K, K through 12, etc. And then an old age pension for the adult, right? And now, since we've taken the same amount from each worker, they still personally have the same take-home pay as persons, but now they have equal livelihoods because the welfare state has made sure that each one of these people are taken care of. So, bada bing, bada boom, equality. And like, again, we can go back to the other thing, and it's like, do you want to use a family definition of income? Do you want to start counting the benefits to the elderly person and to the disabled spouse as pre-tax income? Then that'll change your measure. Are we going to count each one of these people as individuals that have 0 income here? Or are we going to count them as having 1/5 of his income? There's all sorts of shit you can do, and it'll change what the spreadsheet says about what's more important. But like the fundamental dynamics of this are very clear. You got these people who don't work. You got to find some way to get them money if you want to have an equal society. That's what the welfare state does. And I just want to finish with this part because when I publish this piece, invariably there are people like, no, the issue is you got to topple this guy, the capitalist. Once you topple the capitalist, this shit, there won't be any problems anymore. And I mean, I'm all for you on like what you want to do there, but there will still be problems. So in this one, I sort of imagine like we've toppled the capitalists, and instead of a rich money bags figure on the bottom, we have this like co-op, like worker administration or whatever. And even if you do that, if you have equal pay for equal work, but you have unequal distributions of non-workers, you're still going to have unequal livelihoods, very unequal livelihoods. Like, again, this person has 5 times as much income as this guy has. And all these people have on a like per person basis. So they still need the welfare state. So yeah, I mean that pretty much closes it out. I hope this is helpful. I'm getting increasingly tired with numbers. I really want to write a book that's just theory at this point about the welfare state because I see so many of these abuses. It's so much torturing of this data, and I feel like in many ways it's just. You might think, oh, that's helping us understand more and more, we're getting, but it seems to be taking us away from the light. 1940 Switzerland understood the basic mechanics of this graph. They understood this even while being unable to produce this graph. Because they don't have the data, they don't have the computers. So they couldn't produce this graph, but they understood this graph. That's why you got this. Now that we can actually produce this graph, we instead do this shit right here so that we can argue, it's actually predistribution that matters. And weirdly, did you know actually America redistributes the most? Give me a fucking break. Anyways, like, subscribe, share, retweet, leave your comments, and also, hey, if you want to like give me some suggestions on stuff I should cover, or you want me to react to a video or something like that, go ahead and drop that in there too. I'd be happy to do stuff like that. And yeah, so hope this was informative.